Is reality an illusion? Views from Buddhism, Science and Philosophy. Chapter 1. The Reality Question. Why it matters. Ever caught yourself wondering about something seemingly silly? Like, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around, does it actually make a sound? Or, here's one I think about. Is the light in my fridge really on when the door's closed? I mean, I can't see it, so how can I be 100% sure? I remember once, years ago, I had a disagreement with a close friend about something that happened at a party. We both swore we remembered it perfectly, but our stories were completely different. It wasn't that either of us was lying. We just genuinely perceived the same event in two totally separate ways. It made me realize how easily our minds can create different versions of reality. Think about two witnesses to a car crash. They might give completely conflicting reports, not because they're dishonest, but because their brains, in that split second of chaos, process the information differently. In fact, studies have shown that eyewitness testimony, once considered the gold standard of evidence, is surprisingly unreliable. Some research suggests that as many as 1 in 3 eyewitness identifications are incorrect. This happens all the time on every scale. From little arguments with family to huge political divides where people seem to live in alternate universes. So the big question is, how much of what we think of as real is actually created by our own minds, and how much exists out there on its own, whether we're looking or not? Now, some people might immediately object. Of course the tree makes a sound, they might say. Sound waves are physical vibrations. It doesn't matter if anyone's there to hear them. The fridge light works on electricity. It's either on or off, regardless of whether I'm looking. They're absolutely right. There are physical processes happening, independent of our observation. But, and this is where things get interesting, the Buddha, thousands of years ago, pointed to something deeper. He taught that most of our suffering comes from holding on too tightly to our own views, believing they're the only truth. One of the core ideas in Buddhism is dependent origination, the idea that nothing exists entirely on its own. Everything is connected. Everything influences everything else. This includes our minds and our perceptions. For example, a simple smile can make someone's day, while an angry word might create distance. These small actions have ripple effects we might not even realize. So what does this have to do with the falling tree or my fridge light? It's about starting to question the idea that there's one single, fixed reality that everyone experiences the same way. It's about understanding that our perceptions are shaped by our minds, our past experiences, even our moods. The physical vibrations of the falling tree exist, yes, but the experience of sound is something our brains construct. When we start to see this, it changes everything. It makes us more open to other perspectives, less attached to our own opinions, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit more at peace with the world, even when things get messy and confusing. It's not about saying nothing is real. It's about seeing reality and ourselves more clearly. It means recognizing that our perspective is only one possibility, not the only truth. And that realization is the first step on a journey to understanding how our minds shape our world. Chapter 2. The Scientific Perspective. What does science tell us? For a long time, the dominant scientific view of the universe was like a giant, perfectly predictable clock. Think of Isaac Newton's laws of motion and gravity. These laws describe a universe where things operate according to fixed rules, whether or not anyone is there to observe them. This clockwork universe idea suggested that reality is objective and independent. It's important to remember that this model, classical physics, is incredibly useful. It lets us build bridges and send rockets to the moon. It's not wrong, but it's an approximation that works really well in many situations. But, as science advanced, especially with neuroscience and the study of how we perceive things got a lot more complicated. It turns out that our brains aren't just passive receivers of information, like a video camera recording what's in front of it. They're incredibly active constructors of our reality, constantly shaping, filtering, and interpreting the raw data from our senses. And it's not just our vision. All of our senses work this way. Think about sound. What we hear as a continuous sound is actually vibrations in the air. Our ears pick up these vibrations, and our brains turn them into the experience of sound. Remember the Yanni or Laurel audio clip? People heard different words, even though the sound was the same. This shows how much our brains interpret even simple sounds. Or consider phantom limb pain, feeling pain in a limb that's been amputated. The limb is gone, but the brain is still creating the experience of pain. Our sense of touch is also an active construction. We don't feel our clothes on our skin all the time because our brains filter that out. Our sense of taste is influenced by smell, texture, and even how food looks. And our sense of smell can trigger powerful memories and emotions, showing the deep connection between our senses and our minds. Even with vision, our brains are constantly making adjustments. We all have a blind spot in each eye, but our brains fill in the missing information so we don't notice it. The McGurk effect is another example, showing how our senses interact. If you see someone saying ga, but the sound is ba, many people will hear da. It shows how our brains combine visual and auditory information to create a perception, even when those sources of information are conflicting. The brain is trying to find the most likely interpretation, even if it means blending the inputs in a way that doesn't perfectly match either one. Optical illusions offer even more clues. Take the Muller-Lyer illusion. Imagine two lines that are exactly the same length. Now, draw arrowheads on the ends of one line pointing outwards, and arrowheads on the ends of the other line pointing inwards. The line with the outwards pointing arrowheads will look longer, even though it isn't. Or the Ponzo illusion. Imagine train tracks going off into the distance. If you draw two short lines across the tracks, the one that's further away, where the tracks seem closer together, will look longer than the one that's closer, even if they're actually the same size. These illusions aren't just tricks. They show how our brains use clues, like lines and angles, to judge size and distance. These visual biases are similar to the mental biases that Buddhism talks about, the ways our minds distort reality. Now, a neuroscientist might say, wait a minute, these illusions and the McGurk effect are special cases. They don't mean that all of our perception is unreliable. And they'd be partly right. Our brains are also incredibly good at recognizing faces, telling colors apart, and navigating the world. A lot of our perception is accurate and reliable. But the point is that even these seemingly objective processes are still interpretations by the brain. They're not just passive recordings. They are constructed realities, built from sensory input, past experiences, and expectations. What all of this points to is a shift in how science understands reality. It's moving away from the idea of a purely objective, independent world, towards a view where perception plays an active role. It's not that the external world doesn't exist, but that our experience of that world is a co-creation. It's a partnership between what's out there and how our minds process it. This is very similar to the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, where everything arises in dependence on other things, including our minds. This scientific perspective raises a profound question. If our experience of reality is so heavily influenced by our internal processes, how fixed and inherent are the qualities of the things we perceive? This question echoes some of the deeper inquiries within Buddhist philosophy, which we'll explore further. Chapter 3. Western Philosophical Views, Mind and Matter. Philosophers have been wrestling with the question of reality for as long as there's been philosophy. How does the world out there relate to the world in here, in our minds? It's a question that has spawned countless debates and a wide range of perspectives, though perhaps not always wildly different. There are overlaps and ongoing discussions even between seemingly opposing viewpoints. One major school of thought is called realism. Realists believe that there's a real, objective world that exists independently of our minds. The moon continues to orbit the Earth, even when nobody's looking. But realism isn't a monolithic view. There are many different flavors. Naive realism is the common-sense view that we perceive the world directly as it really is. Critical realism, on the other hand, acknowledges that our perception can be influenced by various factors, but still maintains that there's an underlying reality we're trying to understand. Scientific realism is a particularly influential version. It holds that our best scientific theories, the ones that have been rigorously tested and confirmed, give us at least an approximately true description of the real structure of the universe. It's not that scientific realists believe our current theories are perfect or complete, but they argue that the success of science would be a miracle if our theories weren't, in some significant way, latching onto real features of the world. This is often called the no miracles argument. But then there's the opposing view, idealism. Idealists argue that reality, at least as we can know it, is fundamentally mental. One of the most famous proponents was George Berkeley. His famous phrase was, "Esse es percipi." To be is to be perceived. Berkeley argued that the qualities of an object, like its color, shape, and texture, only exist as perceptions in our minds. He challenged the distinction, common at the time, and popularized by John Locke, between primary qualities, like shape and size, which were thought to be inherent in objects, and secondary qualities, like color and taste, which were considered mind-dependent. Berkeley argued that all qualities are, in a sense, secondary. They all depend on a perceiving mind. It is important to note that Berkeley was not a solipsist. He did not deny that other minds exist. He believed that God was the ultimate perceiver, ensuring the continued existence of objects even when no human was perceiving them. Another argument for idealism comes from the difficulty of explaining how mind and matter interact. If they are fundamentally different substances, how can they causally influence each other? Idealism might seem counterintuitive, but it has some interesting modern connections. Think about virtual reality. When you put on a VR headset, you can be immersed in a completely simulated world. While VR shows how our minds can create convincing experiences, it's not to say our everyday reality is just a simulation. The analogy simply highlights the power of the mind to construct our experience. But realism and idealism aren't the only options. Phenomenalism tries to bridge the gap, suggesting that we can only know things as they appear to us. Phenomena, the appearances of things, not as they are in themselves. Immanuel Kant, with his transcendental idealism, argued that our experience is shaped by inherent structures of the mind, but that there is a thing in itself, noumenon, that we cannot directly access. We only know the world as it is filtered through our minds. So, we have a spectrum of views, from those that emphasize the independence of reality to those that emphasize the role of the mind. It's a philosophical puzzle that continues to be debated. Is there a middle ground? Is it possible to reconcile these different perspectives? Perhaps the answer lies in moving beyond these seemingly fixed categories and exploring a different way of thinking about existence and non-existence, a way that resonates with some of the insights found in Eastern traditions. Chapter 4: Buddhist Perspective: Beyond Existence and Non-Existence. Buddhist philosophy offers a unique perspective on the question of reality, one that moves beyond the typical Western dichotomy of does it exist or does it not exist. It's not about choosing between realism and idealism, or even finding a compromise between them, as we discussed with phenomenalism and other Western views. It's about questioning the very framework of those questions. It challenges the assumption that things have to either exist in a fixed, independent way or not exist at all. A core concept in Buddhism is dependent origination, pratitya samutpada. This principle states that nothing exists independently. Everything arises in dependence on other things, in a vast, interconnected web of causes and conditions. Think of your smartphone. It seems like a single solid object. But to exist as a phone, it requires metals mined from the earth, factories to assemble it, workers to build it, electricity to power it, software to run it, and a vast network of satellites to connect it to the world. Take away any one of these elements, and its phoneness disappears. This isn't just true for objects. It's true for everything, including ourselves. Our thoughts, feelings, and even our sense of self are constantly arising and changing, dependent on a multitude of internal and external conditions. We are not fixed, unchanging entities. We are processes, constantly in flux. The Buddhist teachings describe 5 aggregates: skandhas, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, that constantly interact and give rise to the illusion of a permanent, independent self. If everything depends on other things to exist, does anything have inherent existence? This leads us to another key concept: emptiness, sunyata. Emptiness doesn't mean that things don't exist at all. It means that they lack svabhava, which translates to own being or inherent existence. More precisely, it means they lack an essence that exists independently of causes and conditions. Think of water. We use the word water to describe different phenomena: ice, liquid water, and steam, that arise under different conditions. Is there a single, essential waterness that exists independently of these conditions? Or is water simply a label we apply to these different states, none of which have a permanent, unchanging essence? Similarly, our thoughts and emotions arise, change, and dissolve based on conditions. There's no permanent self that's having these thoughts and feelings. There's just the ever-changing flow of experience, the interplay of the 5 aggregates. Buddhism navigates this complex understanding of reality through the two truths doctrine. There's conventional truth, which is the level of everyday experience, where things appear to exist and function in predictable ways. We can use money, drive cars, and have relationships, all based on the conventional understanding that these things are real and have meaning. But there's also ultimate truth, which is the understanding that nothing exists independently or permanently. While conventionally real, ultimately, money is just paper with symbols on it. Cars, while useful and functional on a conventional level, are ultimately temporary collections of metal and plastic. Even our relationships, while deeply meaningful in our lives, are constantly changing and evolving. The middle way, Madhyamaka in Buddhism, is about avoiding the extremes of either believing that everything exists permanently and independently, eternalism, or that nothing exists at all, nihilism. It's about recognizing the validity of both conventional and ultimate truth and navigating our lives with an understanding of both. For example, imagine you're having a conflict with a friend. On a conventional level, the conflict is real, and the emotions you're experiencing are valid. You need to address the situation, communicate your feelings, and try to find a resolution. But, applying the middle way, you can also recognize the impermanence of the situation, the interdependence of everyone involved, and the lack of any fixed inherent self that's being wronged. This understanding can help you to approach the conflict with less anger and attachment, and more compassion and wisdom. It's not about denying the reality of the conflict, but about seeing it in a broader context, understanding that it, like everything else, is impermanent and subject to change. This, according to Buddhism, is key to liberation from suffering. Chapter 5. Living with the Question. Practical Applications. So, we've looked at the science, considered Western philosophy, and examined the Buddhist perspective on reality. But what does all of this mean for our everyday lives? How can we take these seemingly abstract ideas and use them to live with more awareness, less suffering, and greater compassion? One of the most immediate applications is in how we handle conflicts. Think about a time when you disagreed with someone about what happened, or about the right way to do something. Recognizing that our perceptions are constructions, shaped by our individual minds and experiences, can fundamentally change how we approach these situations. Instead of saying, "This is how it is," we can practice saying, "This is how it appears to me." That simple shift in language creates space. It acknowledges that there might be other valid perspectives, and it opens the door to genuine dialogue. It doesn't mean you have to agree with the other person, but it allows you to listen to them, to understand their point of view, without getting caught up in the need to be right. This diffuses arguments and fosters understanding. Another powerful application is in dealing with change and loss. Life is constantly changing. Jobs are lost, relationships end, loved ones pass away, and even our own bodies age and change. But impermanence isn't just about major life events. The weather changes, plans change, our energy levels fluctuate throughout the day. A flower blooms and then fades. Everything is in flux. When we cling to things as if they were permanent, we will suffer when they change, as they certainly will. But when we understand impermanence, not just as an intellectual concept, but as a fundamental truth of existence, we can begin to loosen our grip. We can start to appreciate the preciousness of each moment, knowing that it will never come again. This applies to positive experiences too. Enjoying a beautiful sunset, savoring a delicious meal, or spending time with loved ones. Recognizing that these moments are fleeting can make us appreciate them even more. One way to cultivate this understanding is to notice how your own sense of self shifts and changes. While there's continuity in who you are, you have memories, relationships, and a sense of personal history. You're also not the same person you were 10 years ago, or even yesterday. Your thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and even your physical body are constantly changing. Recognizing this impermanence within ourselves can help us to be less attached to fixed identities and more adaptable to the changes that life throws our way. Here's a simple way to bring these ideas into your daily life. Practice noticing how things are always changing and how your mind shapes your experience. Throughout your day, pick something, a flower, the sky, your breath, and really notice its subtle shifts and changes. This builds a direct awareness of impermanence. And when your mind gets caught up in worries about the future or regrets about the past, gently bring it back to the present moment. Focus on what's happening right now. Just this breath, just this step, just this task. These small moments of awareness can make a big difference. They help you see that your reality isn't fixed, and that you have more flexibility than you might think. These are just small steps, but they can have a profound impact. The question of what is real isn't just a philosophical puzzle. It's a doorway to a different way of living. It's about cultivating awareness, embracing change, and finding peace in the midst of impermanence. It's about living with greater understanding, less attachment, and more compassion, both for ourselves and for others. It is a path, not a destination.